and share my screen. Okay, so welcome to rigorous multiple choice question creation. We're thinking about things, really any sort of assessment, whether it's formative or summative, in which you might have multiple choice questions, whether they're tickets out the door that are not really graded, or obviously a higher stakes assessment like a midterm or final exam. So we're sort of building off of what Angela was saying this morning with alternative assessments. We're getting a little bit more granular and looking at how can we make some of our questions a little more rigorous. So real quick, some objectives for our workshop today. First, we'll take a very brief look at Bloom's taxonomy and take a look at sort of these levels of Bloom's. What do they mean? And then ideally correlate that to creating a multiple choice question or a larger assessment. We'll examine sample multiple choice questions to determine which level of Bloom's taxonomy to which they correlate. And then we'll also make some existing multiple choice questions a little more rigorous. And that's where if you did have your hands on on an old assessment, maybe we'll look at a question or two, and that's about it, just to give you an idea. So defining Bloom's taxonomy. If you're unfamiliar with Bloom's, revised Bloom's, which I don't recall exactly when it was revised, but the original is 1956, and I want to say this was revised maybe sometime in the 1990s or early 2000s. Excuse me. We have 6 levels to Bloom's taxonomy. Probably the most frequent figure that I see, the most frequent image that I see Bloom's arranged in is usually a pyramid. And that's sort of what we see here with these slices of, it kind of reminds me of a layered cake. But it's obviously kind of going up the chain in a pyramid here. There are other images and they all can make sense in their own right. But the simple idea is this: the higher up on Bloom's taxonomy that you are asking questions or that you are requiring activities or assessments be done, the higher the level of thinking that should be required, cognitive engagement. It doesn't have to only be cognitive. There are other parts of Bloom's with the affective domain and the tangible domain, but in the cognitive domain, that's really where we're going to focus on for our multiple choice question creation. So going through a few of these, and I do have some examples that are going to pop up here with revised Bloom's. The largest domain, the one that's probably the easiest, that most of us really have no problems writing questions geared toward, would be the remembering part of Bloom's taxonomy. So recognizing and recalling facts. And when you may have heard this in a previous workshop, I used to teach history for a long time, for 16 years. And so I've got some examples here on some questions that might have been on a previous exam or a test I might have given. And so just some real quick ones that either bring up the idea of recognizing or recalling information. Who led the Continental Army during the American Revolution? Which is the definition, and then there'd be a list of definitions of social Darwinism. So these are pretty, memorization type questions, very common, but obviously not really requiring a whole lot of thinking or problem solving type processes as far as our students are concerned. It's really about recalling and, memorizing facts and being able to just sort of identify those facts. The next level, understanding. Comparing is one way to do this. So taking those facts and at least being able to now move up a level and say, all right, here's the facts, but also here's what it means. So for example, again, a previous history question I might have asked related to the women's rights movement, more civil rights in the 1970s, based on the primary source, and there would be an article or a phrase or something that students would have to read. Compare the involvement of females in high school sports before and after the passage of Title IX legislation. So in this case, they would have a list of resources in this article and then be able to compare one side, the before Title IX, to after Title IX was passed, and then make the comparison what sort of gains were there for females in high school sports, specifically the way this question was geared. Application is what I would call a mid-level Bloom's question, definitely you've got to work some of that recalling and understanding, right? That remembering and understanding in order to now apply information. So on the left, you can see with applying, right? Apply the facts, rules, concepts, and ideas. So we're taking something and then we are using it to actually help solve a problem a little bit. It might not be the most complicated of problems. A real easy or a common, I should say, setup for this is when a student may need to identify elements coming from some sort of chart or some sort of table that has facts and figures in it, right? So use the chart or the map to identify trends, for example. So I'll relate it to a history question real quick. I may have asked students in the past something along the lines of use this table, and it was or a chart. It was the economic chart, right? The GDP of America in the 1920s going to the end of the 1920s when the Great Depression started. And really, what could they interpret from it? So there'd be a series of multiple choice questions of what were you able to get out of that table? How would you apply this information? What happened to the economy? So that's an example. And I do have, by the way, before I forget, I do have some more concrete examples to show you here in a little bit. Now, before I go into our next three, the highest levels of Bloom's, the three highest levels, what I hope you're catching on to so far is that the higher you go, the more likely it incorporates at least pieces of the layers below it. So think about what I just said with apply, right? You have to recall some facts and then use those facts in order to solve some sort of problem, right? To apply that information in some sort of way. So if we're thinking about applying as incorporating pieces of understanding and remembering, and analysis would be no different. That analysis is going to incorporate pieces of remembering, understanding, and applying in order to analyze information, in order to break it down into component parts. Differentiating is definitely one area that would fit into analyzing information, right? Which statement best supports the idea of social Darwinism? And then I might have, or I not might, but I remember my multiple choice questions. One, choice A was a quote from Darwin himself. Choice B was a quote from, and I tried to use people from that time era, right? So quote B from late 1800s would be from someone like John D. Rockefeller. Quote C from maybe, for example, President McKinley, and then quote D might be from a journalist of that era, for example, maybe someone like William Randolph Hearst. And ultimately, students would have to read all four quotes and really differentiate, okay, well, what do I know, right? So recalling facts and understanding, what do I know about each one of these people that said these things? Darwin and McKinley and Rockefeller, for example. And then how can I apply what I know about them toward what I know social Darwinism is, or what I hope they know social Darwinism is. And by doing that, they can differentiate between and then select the one that most closely supports the idea of social Darwinism. Evaluate, judging the value of information or ideas. So I'll stick with the idea of judge, or judging or justifying. A question I would use would similar to the one about analysis. And you can see here it says after reading the excerpt from the majority decision. So there's usually something that accompanies along with it, right? A paragraph, a quote in this case from a Supreme Court justice on the majority decision side. Which argument justifies the statement that Brown v. Board of Education is the most important Supreme Court decision of the 20th century? Now, this may sound like an opinion question at first. It really isn't. What it's really saying is, again, as a student, they're sort of required to look at this and say, all right, one of these statements is justifying the idea that Brown v. Board is an extremely important Supreme Court decision, especially for the 20th century, that it desegregated schools. They have to recall that information. They have to understand what desegregation means. So I'm working back through my stages there, right? Then they're going to think about applying it to the time frame. I've given them a little hint in the question with saying decision of the 20th century. Even I could have given them a little bit more targeted hint by saying, Brown v. Board, and then in parentheses put decided in 1954. So I could have given them a specific time frame, but I am relying on them to recall information a little bit that it was the 1950s. Excuse me. And then in the majority decision, by the reading, they're going to look at that and apply that information. To very quickly paraphrase, the majority decision basically said that segregating schools created an unequal or an unequitable learning situation for students, and that it was therefore unconstitutional, that you were treating citizens differently from each other through this concept of segregation. So putting all that together, they really then have to evaluate my choices that would have been supplied, choices A, B, C, D, or yes, A, B, C, D. Which one really supported the idea that this was the most important civil rights legislation of the 20th century, maybe even in this case, Supreme Court decision. Now, finally, this last one, creation. This one, when it comes to creating multiple choice questions, is, in my opinion, the hardest one to try to create a multiple choice question for. In Angela's session this morning, she made a very good point to say, and I 100% agree with her, that authentic assessment, which a lot of times the genesis of that is creation, is extremely hard to do, and maybe in some cases almost impossible with multiple choice questions. So a lot of times, what my very quick disclaimer, it can be done. It's tough to do. It is the highest order of thinking according to revised Bloom's, and demonstrating that the processes, the cognitive domain there. But it's probably better served by assessing in other ways. It's probably better served by assessing with research papers, project-based learning, authentic assessment. So if we're talking, going about to enter the workforce, the kinds of things they actually would be required to do in the workforce. I'll switch gears away from history and put it to you like this. A former teacher friend of mine, to assess his students, he would actually have them wrap. He was a PT teacher. He would actually have them wrap ankles properly, address wounds properly. They were simulations, but that was certainly hitting a way higher level of Bloom's, and it was authentic. Those would be the kinds of things that they would do when they actually get in the job field, versus they're not going to sit there and only answer questions about how to wrap an ankle. They would actually perform, right? So very hard to do with multiple questions, multiple choice, but it is possible. So as an example, my history question: how would you adapt to life on the frontier in the Western United States in the mid 1800s to create a different local government? So this one, I'm not going to say it's a terrific question. As I said, usually better served as an essay component. But what I can say is this, that there would also be resources accompanying that question. So again, whether it be reading or a diagram of government structure, there's obviously, you need to recall facts and understand those facts. What was life like on the frontier, especially in the mid 1800s? You have to recall the facts and apply the facts of what government structure should look like in the United States of America, and how the supremacy clause in the Constitution applies and holds states and local governments accountable to creating a structure that fits the U.S. Constitution. You'll have to analyze that combination of the government and what life is like, and then you're going to have to judge and evaluate, will this work for people, in the frontier, out on the frontier in the 1800s, when we typically think of it as the Wild West, right, and almost lawlessness. And so their choices that would accompany this would be things along the lines of choosing which concept of government would probably fit that time, era, and that place and that circumstance the best. Now, everything I just spoke about a little bit is a little abstract, so we're going to start to move into a little concrete things. I am going to show the old version of Bloom's, the 1956 through roughly 1990s. There's a lot of crossover, and on the next slide in just a moment, we'll actually point out the differences between revised Bloom's and the older Bloom's. The good news is The revised Bloom's, it's really just transposing. So for example, I'll jump to it real quick. Old Bloom's had synthesis or creation as its second highest level, and evaluation was the highest. But in current or revised version of Bloom's, evaluation is actually the second highest level, and synthesis, creation, is the highest level. So really, it's just switch these two is pretty much the difference. Coming back real quick to our first one, some things that can help you not only design course and module objectives, but I also use these when I write my questions. So if I'm just going for those recalling facts, right, our lowest level of Bloom's, not Nooms, excuse me. I'm asking students to, tell me something, recall something, identify something, label something. So I'll put it again in the history context. If I have a map of the 13 colonies and choice A, B, C are on different colonies, right? They're just going to identify which one was the Virginia colony. That's a relatively low level Bloom's type of question. Comprehension, finding information, sometimes from text, a lot of times from text, but really just demonstrating now that you understand what those facts mean. So possibly compare, contrast, demonstrate, discuss. These keywords would probably be found again in my question to help move that along. Application, same thing, right? Our new situation, solve problems, as I was mentioning before. Math does a lot of application questions. You could make an argument that maybe most math questions sort of start at application. Maybe not, I won't say all, but most probably start here because there is so much calculate this, calculate that, problem solve, X, Y, Z. Categorizing, very common, especially in science classes, right? Categorizing things into different parts of the body, for example. In government, when I would teach government, we would categorize things as being legislative actions versus executive actions versus judicial action, and so on. So we've got our application there. Analysis, we're usually now examining things in detail. So inspecting, highlighting, let's see, we have distinguish and divide and research. So you can see the keywords here. We're taking those facts and understandings and now and applications and really sort of diving deeper. Remember, revised Bloom synthesis is actually on the highest end. So I'm going to skip over to evaluation real quick, where judging, where criticizing, identifying criteria, perhaps, interpreting things. So here's a statement, what did the author mean type of questions. And then finally, our creation, our synthesis. How can we write a multiple choice question that asks students to hypothesize, right? They're going to have a choice of hypotheses from which to choose from, and the question might be worded that way. So that's a quick little more, again, a little more concrete idea of our reminder of Bloom's here. I do have a very quick Zoom poll, and I'm going to stop the share for just a moment and pull up the poll. And if you could participate in this real quick, please. Your best estimate for yourself, which level of Bloom's taxonomy do you use most frequently when writing multiple choice questions? Okay. And I should be sharing the results. And I know we only had a vote of 1 right now, but that's okay. So we have analysis. I would say that that's probably a very common response. When do you have something to add?
No, I made a mistake. I thought I could have choose more than one answers.
Oh, no, I did limit it to the 1. So you just orally, yeah. Do you want to, what else would you have chosen?
Depending on the class I'm teaching, at the fundamental level, for example, pharmacology and pathophysiology, it's probably more of a remembering.
Okay.
And then as I go up to health assessment and where decisions are made, then they're going to be higher level
okay.
of of the learning.
And if you're differentiating from levels, like undergrad versus graduate school and everything in between, that does make some sense. When it does come to assessment design, I'll go even outside of higher ed and go back to K-12, which I used to teach in high school level, 9 through 12. Even when I was teaching freshmen or 10th graders, before eventually teaching seniors, I would always try to have a good mixture on my assessments of the various levels of blooms, where on things like homework assignments and quizzes, I might have mostly lower end blooms, things that were the knowledge, or the remembering, the understanding in some application. Quizzes would have a good mixture of those, but then start to bring in some analysis. My other A few other homework assignments might have 1 or 2 evaluate, create type questions. But then on the test, on the exam, to conclude a unit, for example, my mixture, I would try to make it about as even as possible across the board, where we have 6 levels of blooms, and if I was writing a 50 question test, I would have about 8 questions per. Well, create, as I mentioned, create's hard to do on a multiple choice, so I would say it was about 8 questions per level of blooms, except create. Create was probably only 3 or 4, but then I would always mix in, an essay question, something like that, to hit that create component of blooms. So we're really tapping into a lot of different cognitive levels there by doing that. So before I get further,